Welcome to the Bulwark Podcast. Happy Monday. This is an extraordinary Monday. Not only will Donald Trump lose the presidential election again, it is kind of the Groundhog Day that Trump loses again and again and again. Well, he's going to lose officially when all 538 electors vote, and they're gathering all around the country to cast those votes. And he will lose by, what is the count? I think 306 to 232. Also, today is the day when it is very likely that we will hit 300,000 deaths from the coronavirus pandemic, which is an extraordinary landmark. But also, this comes on the day when the vaccine is being widely distributed, and we're starting to see the first people being vaccinated. So we have the good news and the bad news, and we want to talk about all of this with our special guest, Kim Wehle, who joins us, who is not only a constitutional scholar, but also has written a book, Everything You Need to Know About Voting. So this is your moment, isn't it, Kim? I mean, voting, constitution, all of that stuff. Great.
Yes, all this stuff that was boring for most of my career is now sexy for for dubious reasons. It'd be nice if basic constitutional separation of powers and voting rights were not hanging on by a thread. We can have another pod when this is in our rearview mirror, I hope, but I'm not so sure anytime soon.
You could almost, if you wanted to look on the bright side, this has been like a crash course in civics and constitutional law and voting rights, just all of the details they're happening here. So before we do this, I just want to remind listeners again, we are very, very grateful that you listen to our podcast and read the articles on the Bulwark. Over the last several days, we've made our newsletters free, so you get a sense of what the Bulwark Plus subscribers are seeing. It's more like a membership partnership because this podcast and the main website are going to remain free, but we do have a Bulwark Plus and we're very, very grateful for all of the support to keep this fight going on. And if you sign up for Bulwark Plus, you are not only will be getting every one of our my Morning Shots newsletter, JVL's Triad newsletter. We're developing some other newsletters I'll tell you about in a few days, as well as a number of podcasts. So if you have not yet subscribed to Bulwark Plus, please at least consider it. Okay, so Kim, this is really an extraordinary day. I don't think that many Americans have ever actually followed the casting of the electoral votes, which has really been a pro forma thing right up until today. But now people are sort of hanging on it. At what point will Donald Trump officially lose the election? Will Joe Biden get 270 electoral votes? My best guess is sometime around 5 o'clock tonight. That when California or some state casts its vote. But today's the official date, isn't it? I mean, it's like
Right, under the Electoral Count Act, today is the day that the electors meet and its pro formas indicate to cast their slate for president. And remember, what they do today is dictated by the law of their particular state. The state legislatures have passed laws directing electors what they're supposed to do today. And part of the nonsense we've been hearing in terms of Donald Trump's efforts to steal the election from Joe Biden have been phone calls to some of these legislatures to try to get them to change the law that governs what the electors are going to do today. So far, that hasn't happened. So this is an important day. This is, in terms of protecting democracy and the legitimacy of elections, period, getting past this day without serious shenanigans is a good thing for democracy. So, we can breathe easier in the morning.
it's a good thing for democracy, but also an indication of the world that we live in right now, that they've had to shut down the Michigan State Capitol for the vote because there have been so many threats. And there is this sort of just cloud of violence and menace that's hanging over this vote. And we can talk about this a little bit later. But what's happening in Michigan has got to be a little chilling, particularly after a weekend where you've had spasms of violence from Washington, D.C. to Washington State.
Yeah, I mean, remember, the governor of Michigan had a defuncted or debunked kidnapping plot against her. This has been going on for a while, and I think it's no surprise or it to many people that this comes from the very top of the echelons of the American system of government, that is from the White House, in stoking violence. And if you read experts. There's a great book called How Democracies Die. Two experts, I think, at Harvard. Stoking violence from the position of power is one way that democracies have traditionally slipped into something other than democracies. And I mean, it's good that Donald Trump is on his way out the door again. Good for democracy itself, but we've seen so much destruction. I mean, the House is smashed and in tatters. It's going to need a lot of restructuring and rebuilding under a Biden administration going forward. We're not out of the woods, and I think the fact that we're tolerating this. I mean, you mentioned other parts. I live right outside of Washington, and there are 4 people stabbed in the hospital due to violence around Proud Boys challenging the legitimacy of this election. These are scary times, and we can't just shrug them off, even under Biden.
No, and under normal circumstances, I was going to say under circumstances that are even remotely normal, today would be the end. Of course, it would have been over long before today. Yesterday, rather extraordinary interview with Chris Wallace from Fox News and Steve Scalise, who is one of the top Republicans in the House of Representatives, who was asked whether or not, at least today, I mean, after today, Republicans would take the opportunity to acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president-elect. And let's play some of this because it's rather extraordinary. Because one of the stories here, I think the most disturbing story, and we've talked about this before, is not the fact that Donald Trump is a narcissistic authoritarian. I mean, we've known all of this. The real gut punch has been the way that Republicans have not only gone along with him, the fact that 126 members of the House of Representatives, nearly 2/3 of the House conference, signed on to this bogus bullshit lawsuit that the Supreme Court drop kicked on Friday night. I mean, the indication of how far they're willing to go. And there's a lot of speculation. I don't think it's speculation. I think it's a certainty at this point that you're going to have a floor challenge to these legitimately cast electoral votes on January 6th, when joint session of Congress, normally in a pro forma way, reads the results of the election and certifies the election of the president. But here's Steve Scalise on with Chris Wallace, who's putting his feet to the fire a bit.
The president-elect in those 4 states. Do you feel comfortable throwing out millions of votes of your fellow Americans?
Well, nobody wants any votes thrown out, Chris. And in fact, the 70+ million votes that are also at stake for President Trump. Well, no, if you look at the Texas lawsuit, what it was saying is there are some states that didn't follow the laws that were on their books. The Constitution is very clear that it's state legislatures that set the process for having electors.
With all
some
due respect,
Secretary
sir,
of State changed those rules.
The Supreme Court threw that out. They didn't even hear it.
The Supreme Court said they weren't going to take the case. They said Texas didn't have standing. They said Texas didn't have standing. They didn't say they were going to address the merits. Look, the Supreme Court, I think a lot of people know, didn't want to be anywhere near this court. They don't like getting in the middle of disputes between other branches of government. And that's just something they've done throughout history.
So bottom line, even though the electors on tomorrow are more than 270 of them are going to say that Joe Biden is the next president of the United States, you're not willing to recognize him as the president-elect, and you're not willing to stop contesting this election.
Well, hold on, Chris. First of all, Joe Biden has been going through a transition that even President Trump supported, while he's also following what the court allows. There are legal challenges allowed. Nobody said back during Bush v. Gore, prior to the Supreme Court finally resolving it, and ultimately there was electors met, there was a swearing in. Nobody disputed that, maybe some on the Democrat side, but you didn't see people ask prior to that to pass judgment before it was fully resolved. Let the legal process play out. But if you want to restore trust by millions of people who are still very frustrated and angry about what happened, that's why you've got to have this whole system play out. There will be a president sworn in on January 20th. But let's let this legal process play itself out.
So, Kim Wehle, the legal process has played out. I mean, there was an article in the Washington Post over the weekend talking about the near unanimity across the nation's judiciary. At least 86 judges, ranging from judges serving at the lowest levels of state court systems to members of the U.S. Supreme Court, rejected at least one post-election lawsuit filed by Trump or his supporters. Across the board, they haven't won cases at the state level, at the federal trial court level, at the appellate court level, at the U.S. Supreme Court level, which has told them twice to get off their lawn. And yet, here's Steve Scalise say, well, we have to let the legal process play out. Well, yeah. It's played out, hasn't it?
Yes, and listening to that where he sounds like he knows what he's talking about and throws out words like standing and as a law professor that teaches law students how to bring cases and what kind of basic things need to be in a complaint to get past go. I mean, I literally just get a lump in my throat because there's so much misinformation in that statement. I did a piece that yesterday came out in Politico
Yeah.
arguing that there are rules in place to actually sanction or penalize lawyers for bringing these kinds of garbage lawsuits. I mean, you cannot just file anything in a court. Courts have limited jurisdiction. They're busy. They should be preserved for people that have valid claims. The two basic things you need are one, a law that you allege is violated, that's been missing, and two, some facts, some good faith facts. That's missing too. I mean, Rudy Giuliani, waving around in the Michigan legislature a binder full of affidavits, none of which he's willing to put in before court because the court could sanction him for putting forth something that he hasn't actually validated prior to filing it in the court. And let me just put a pin in this. This does not take a lawyer to understand what these members of Congress in 18 states, did, and they failed. They are basically arguing to change our system of government itself. We are government by we the people. We are
Mhm.
government, by people voting and choosing their own electors. Why? Because the framers did not want an unlimited monarch anymore. That case that he says should have gone forward, and people are now saying it was unfair that the Supreme Court didn't take this case, essentially is saying throw out the votes based on technicalities for 4 states and then direct that legislatures just hand the electoral college slates to Donald Trump. That's not a democracy. That is something else. That is having politicians entrench themselves in power and decide who stays in power. That's stunning. And if they want to do that, they need to try to get enough states to vote for a constitutional convention and actually scrap the Constitution itself. It's that outrageous. People need to understand it.
And I think people are actually understanding it, and I've cited Andrew McCarthy, who writes for National Review, has been very, very sort of Trump adjacent for the last few years. He did an interesting piece about one of the Wisconsin cases. This was the federal lawsuit, and it was decided over the weekend by a Trump-appointed federal judge who just slam dunked them. And basically, what this federal judge, was hearing the Wisconsin challenge did was he invited Trump's lawyers to submit evidence of fraud. Okay, if you have evidence, give it to me. They had none. So he invited them, okay, argue the legal merits. They really had none. Here's a great line from McCarthy's piece is there was no there. Despite telling the country for weeks that this was the most rigged election in history, the campaign did not think it was worth calling a single witness. Despite having the opportunity of a hearing before a Trump appointee who was willing to give the campaign ample opportunity to prove its case, the campaign said basically, never mind. So this has been remarkable. Now, listen, one of the things that I think is really extraordinary about this has been the division this has exposed on the right among the judges. David French has a piece in Time magazine where he talks about the Supreme Court unanimously reject, and they did unanimously reject the Texas challenge, right? I mean, I don't know how
Right.
you, yeah. I mean,
There
no
were two
judge said,
annoying, I think, frankly, annoying little, comments by Alito and Thomas. It was totally unnecessary, but yeah, because it's getting misunderstood. But yes, absolutely rejected it as they had to. They had no choice.
yeah, exactly. And French argues with this single act, the Supreme Court dramatically exposed a fascinating division within the conservative movement. Time and again, elected officials supported quixotic and frivolous judicial challenges to the outcome, like Ted Cruz, for example, or remained silent. At the same time, the conservative legal movement, you can disagree with them on many points, especially its members of the judicial branch, crushed Trump's fever dream of an improbable second term. So the difference that you're seeing here, the people who believe that conservative judges are supposed to hand conservatives wins versus this conservative judiciary who's I may be disappointed or shocked some people by saying, yeah, but we're going to uphold the law. We are not going to put partisan advantage or your desire to remain in power above what the Constitution actually says. Because this is kind of a remarkable moment where you have judges all across the ideological spectrum telling Donald Trump to pound sand. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
it's going to be a kind of a good moment.
It is. There's one branch that is standing, and I mean, I do worry that without some kind of sanctions or pushbacks or accountability for that, we're going to see more gamesmanship and abusing the court system for political reasons. But it's not getting anywhere. I mean, there is. The example I give my students is you have to have a law that bans certain behavior, and if you prove stuff, you get something. So you might have someone give you stink eye on the subway, and that really offends you, but you can't go to court and sue. There's no anti stink eye law. Likewise, there's no law that gives states the ability to cancel other states' votes
Yes.
because you don't like how they did it. I mean, that the Supreme Court cannot make that stuff up. That is called judicial activism, and it is supremely conservative to say don't use the courts to achieve ends that you could not achieve politically. And even the Supreme Court dismissing on standing grounds. I know that Scalise used that word. Justice, and I tweeted about this. I did a huge deep dive scholarly article back in 2008 on standing. Standing doctrine is Justice Scalia's baby in part, again, to keep judges out of the business of doing the work of politicians. And that's what these judges are saying. Listen, we are not politicians. We call balls and strikes based on law, based on facts. There's no law, there's no facts, go away.
Well, this is also a fundamental issue of states' rights, which is that Texas cannot tell Wisconsin which votes to count any more than I think people would want New York to tell Alabama or Texas who to vote. So this was a fundamental issue of states' rights. It is interesting, and this goes back to this Wisconsin federal case. One of the arguments has been that you're hearing from Trump world, and I want you to clarify this, is that it's solely up to the legislature to determine the manner by which electors are chosen. And the judge in the Wisconsin case said, yes, the manner, which means popular vote, doesn't mean the means. And we're getting into the weeds here, which is that the details about how votes are cast, those technical administrative details, do not all require statutory approval. That's why you have elections commissions, secretaries of state, other people who administer elections who can make discretionary choices without necessarily legislature's approval. And so he found on that distinction that the Trump folks were trying to make, he said there's no legal merit. There's nothing that any of these officials in Wisconsin have done that violate the Constitution in any way whatsoever on the merits.
Right. We are going to see this again, though, Charlie. I know this is something that probably Congress needs to step in and clarify. There is an argument that, and I think there are probably people in the Supreme Court that agree with it, that election laws can only be passed by the legislature. That sort of power baton can't be handed off. Now, if that were the case at the federal level, there would be no such thing as a cabinet and agencies, because agencies do stuff that are called regulations all the time. That is technically the power of Congress. But there are a couple other problems with this. One is timing. If you don't like how a state law is being implemented, the time generally to challenge that is prior to an election. And I did a piece last week in the Atlantic that sort of looks at election law and says most of the time when challenges to election laws come up, it's pre-election, and usually it's by voters that want to get to the polls. So a state passes a law, makes it harder. Voters sue and say this is a violation of the Constitution because I want greater access. There's no serious precedent for after the fact, after an election, coming in saying, you know what, way back when you tweaked the law, that was unfair to me in another state and my voters. So we're going to, after the fact, cancel out votes to make my remedy, to make me whole. Again, the remedy has to be tailored to whatever the right is. Generally, that would be giving access to the polls. There is no way of saying, listen, Texas voter, you think it's unfair what happened in Pennsylvania. So to make things fair for you in Texas, let's cancel 7 million votes in Pennsylvania. It's a complete logical disconnect, which is why it's going nowhere, which is why, though, I think some damage has been done. There's so much misinformation now, and we're going to see more of these silly lawsuits that hurt the integrity of the electoral process and damage the courts, in my view.
Well, I also remind me to bring this up because also I think there's going to be more of a legislative attempt to make it harder to vote. That a lot of Republican legislatures are going to use this as a pretext to make it tougher to vote. Well, I was really struck by Scalise saying we're not trying to throw out any votes, when in fact that's literally what they were trying to do. Let me tell you how it played. Let me tell you a story about Wisconsin, how this played out. because I think this is kind of an educational civics lesson. So there's a prominent businessman in Wisconsin named Douglas Hagerman, who wrote a piece for the local newspaper about his experience, and he's just furious about what the Trump campaign is trying to do with his vote. So he lives in Milwaukee, and he votes in the election by absentee ballot. He tells this story. So on September 2nd, he applies for his absentee ballot by email to the City of Milwaukee Elections Commission, receives a reply the next day confirming the application was received. His photo ID is on file with the commission. He received his ballot by mail, so he fills it out. His wife witnesses it. He personally deposits it in a city ballot drop box on October 7th. Those drop boxes were authorized by the Wisconsin Election Commission, which was created by the Republican legislature and approved by Scott Walker. So then he goes back and he checks his vote on mygov.wigov, the Wisconsin Election Commission website. It shows that his ballot was received on October 8th, and it's fine. And he says, so now the Trump campaign, now, weeks after the election, is asking the courts to throw out his vote, because they seek this post-election ruling that drop boxes should not have been approved by the commission. So here's a Wisconsin voter who did everything that he was told to do, followed all the rules set up by the commission. And what Trump is basically saying to the court is, weeks after the fact, we could have challenged this before the election, but weeks after the fact, we want you to disenfranchise all of those votes, invalidate the votes already cast. And you can see how mad he is here. He says, here is Trump's repugnant sleight of hand. He would turn a legal ballot into an illegal ballot after the voting is finished. He hopes the courts will flip the election to the candidate who got fewer Wisconsin votes. So here's a guy who is going, this is my vote. I did everything right, and they're trying to disenfranchise me. And this is a scandal that I don't think we can let go of.
Yeah, I mean, that's the case, frankly, I would take as a lawyer. The one when his vote gets disenfranchised, he gets canceled, and then you walk in and say it's a violation of his due process, or the government's a stop from doing that because he reasonably relied on all the procedures and did it properly. And let's not forget all the down ballot races. I mean, the Republicans, Trump's party did pretty well at the federal level anyway, in the House and in the Senate. So a ballot is a ballot is a ballot. So are we saying that we have to redo the election down ballot? I mean, there's sort of the hypocrisy of saying, no, just the presidential one is the one that was somehow tainted by these drop boxes. That's, I think, lost in the mess of logic. But logic is a lot to ask for these days, Charlie.
It is a lot to ask for. Okay, speaking of things to ask for, so Stephen Miller, who is the Trump White House homunculus, who's been giving all the advice about immigration, is on Fox and Friends this morning, and he's trying to spin the fact that, just simply because Donald Trump is going to officially lose the election today doesn't mean he's lost the election. Let's play the soundbite from Stephen Miller from Fox News this morning.
What would stop that?
Great to be on this morning. Thank you for having me. The only date in the Constitution is January 20th. So we have more than enough time to right the wrong of this fraudulent election result and certify Donald Trump as the winner of the election. As we speak today, an alternate slate of electors in the contested states is going to vote, and we're going to send those results up to Congress. This will ensure that all of our legal remedies remain open. That means that if we win these cases in the courts, that we can direct that the alternate slate of electors be certified. The state legislatures in Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania can do the same. And likewise, Congress has that opportunity as well to do the right thing. If you just cured 3 simple constitutional defects, Donald Trump's the winner of this election. Whether it's the signature matching in Georgia that was illegally changed as a result of a consent decree without the legislature's approval, or whether it's the hundreds of thousands of improperly cast ballots in Wisconsin, absentee voters who never actually submitted the request for an absentee ballot, or whether you're talking in Pennsylvania, the clear equal protection violation when Democrat ballots were cured in advance of Election Day and Republican ballots weren't. These are just 3 of hundreds of violations that we've documented, and those 3 violations alone make Donald Trump the winner of the 2020 election.
Right, and we know that.
All right, Kim Wehle, where do you start with this? So the only date that counts, he says, is January 20th. So because that's the only one in the Constitution. So none of the laws actually count, none of the statutes, none
Yeah,
of the
we've had an
congressional.
Electoral Count Act for a few hundred years, right? Yeah, no, I guess we pick and choose what's a law and what's not a law.
So alternative electors being elected today. So there's like a shadow electoral college vote, according to Stephen Miller.
Well, I mean, there have been disputed elections in that a state can't decide on a particular slate of electors. That's why these certifications have been absolutely crucial, because on January 6th, if you read the statute, which is kind of a mess, it's not very clear, but on January 6th, when the House votes, the only way that I can see that things could go off the rails for Joe Biden is if a particular state did not certify for one candidate or the other. But at this point, we don't have that ambiguity. So he's just wrong. And unfortunately, Stephen Miller says this stuff and people believe it. And I just want to put a pin in one other thing. This concept of fraud that gets thrown around. Fraud, Charlie, is a crime. Under federal law, electoral fraud can put you in jail for 5 years, which is why people don't do it. It's not worth it in one election. It means literally lying and victimizing someone. So pretending you're a dead voter and voting as a dead voter, or pretending that you are someone else and voting in their stead. That is not the same as what he's saying, signatures this or that, or drop boxes this or that. These are technicalities. They have nothing to do with actually duping the American public and your state into casting an illegal ballot that is you're not legitimately authorized to cast. That is a fundamental distinction.
It is a fundamental distinction, but it's one that they're trying to fudge because, for example, during the argument on Saturday before the Wisconsin Supreme Court, the judge, the Trump lawyer was asked, well, do you have any examples of fraud? They didn't have any. But he says, but all of these votes are illegal. Now, what he's trying to say is that even a vote, leaving aside fraud, the way you just described it, it doesn't have to have any dishonesty. If there's a technical mistake by anyone involved in the process, that becomes an illegal vote. So voters who listen to what they were told by their city clerk or listen to the guidance of the Wisconsin Election Commission, those votes become illegal, which in the minds of, I think, of a lot of lay people, because obviously this is not working with judges at any level, illegal vote sounds like fraudulent vote, which obviously it's not. Hey, by the way.
Right. That's
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, that's my stink eye in the subway example. There is no law that says if you find a technicality in a process, somehow you get to cancel votes. That does not exist. There's no law. Now, if they want that, they can get legislatures to pass that law, but courts can't make that up. There is no there.
So going back to your point that you'd made a little bit earlier, which I think is underrated. I think you made a great point that you had all kinds of other votes on, other races on the ballot that, and no congressman has, has said, hey, I don't think I should take my seat because I think that this was rigged. Well, as we know, early voting is starting today in Georgia for the senatorial runoff. Kelly Loeffler, who of course is like all in with Trump in attacking the governor and attacking the Secretary of State, both Republicans in Georgia, saying that the election was rigged. She was also on Fox this morning, and they asked her a question. Well, if that election was rigged, what about yours? And listen to her quote unquote answer.
We've heard from the president, who said that the election was stolen from him, that it was rigged in November. So for the people of Georgia who are thinking about early voting, what can you say to them? They've heard the election was rigged in November, so why vote now?
Well, Steve, great question, because we've built a robust organization to make sure that every legal vote is counted and every illegal vote is thrown out.
So what's different now than it was in November, where it's no longer rigged?
Yeah, so we're in the courts right now asking for better signature verification processes, a bipartisan verification, to have consistent verification county to county, as well as the addition of 4,000 poll watchers. We also have a statewide organization getting out the vote. 1,000 workers going across the state, backed by 40,000 volunteers. If we vote, we will win. If we don't vote, we will lose the country. We are the firewall to socialism. And you saw in my debate last week, I'm running against the most radically liberal candidate that has ever run for the Senate. He's someone that would defund the police. He refused to renounce socialism. We have to push back against this radical agenda of the left, and it's up to Georgia voters to do that.
Senator, I grew up in South Carolina, and
so not much of an answer, is there? I mean,
Well,
this is the problem that she's got. That if you're saying it's rigged, it's it's terrible, then why bother to vote?
right. I mean, and this is also just as an aside, she's great at memorizing talking points, but not so terrific at pivoting or sort of thinking on her feet, so to speak. And I think that's a moment where she just didn't know what to answer, so she went back to her basic talking points, which doesn't seem to matter, unfortunately, to the Trumpian constituency. Again, logic, rationality. I mean, they hear fraud, they hear socialism, they hear whatever they hear, and as you indicated at the top of the show, it's whipping people up into a violent froth, and that's really disturbing. And I frankly think every member of Congress who signed on to that brief in Texas has no business being in politics, because they represent the people, not the powerful, under our Constitution in theory. And this is just a nightmare, Charlie.
See, this is no longer a legal challenge. There's no legitimate legal route for Trump to overturn this election. They have no evidence of fraud. They have no evidence of significant irregularities. There's no law that is going to allow the federal courts to throw out tens of millions of votes. So this is all about something else, right? It's all about fan service for the right-wing base. It's all about raising money, as much money as possible, right? It's all about delegitimizing the Biden administration, maybe launching Donald Trump's 2024 campaign. So this is all at this point simply political. The legal aspect of this is gone. And I think you're going to see this kind of nakedly on January 6th, where having lost every single lawsuit, and there's zero prospect that they're going to score any points in the courts, is that it's going to be simply a Democrat-Republican up or down vote in the House and the Senate. And I wonder, and this with a sinking feeling, whether or not this is going to be seen as as another loyalty test, that if you're a congressman and you do not vote, to throw out, my vote in Wisconsin or millions of votes in Pennsylvania, that somehow you're cuck, somehow you're not willing to fight, somehow if you're not willing to undermine democracy, then somehow you're being weak. And that's a political statement, but it also creates a precedent for the future, as you pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions is, and I'm not a political analyst, but how much power Donald Trump will retain over the Republican Party as a private citizen. And obviously, it looks like a number of people in the Republican caucus are concerned that they'll lose their power if they lose his favor, even when he's out of office technically. The other thing is, whoever's a candidate in 2020 for the Republican Party, I wouldn't be surprised if they're going to campaign on the fraudulent 2020 election.
Yep.
And that is, I know that in your newsletter today, you quoted at length from Hannah Arendt, the famous scholar on totalitarianism. I mean, that's a nonpartisan problem for America. I mean, people don't understand what a privilege it is that we live in a legitimate democracy where elections are adhered to and are respected. And this destruction, I mean, Vladimir Putin has got to be having the ticker tape parade of his life right now. I mean, this is the degrading the legitimacy of elections takes the power away from the people. And that's where I feel like the abdication of responsibility is happening amongst the Republicans.
And it feels we've been prepped for this. We keep destroying one norm after another, and people go, that's okay. I didn't care about that norm. I didn't care about that norm. Well, we elected him to blow things up. That's okay. So one norm after another has been thrown away. And you pay the price for it when you now get to the ultimate norm, which is the peaceful transfer of power and recognizing the legitimacy of a democratic election, but also the way we've become inured to lies and bullshit and untruths, that we're at a moment now where there are millions of Americans that are going, I don't know what the truth is, but I'm going to choose to believe X. I'm going to buy into this conspiracy theory. Or if I hear somebody on Fox or Newsmax or OAN, say this was stolen, I'm going to go with it. So not only do you have this attack on the Constitution and democratic norms, but how do you have a democracy if we don't live in a shared reality of facts and truth?
Right. And I mean, maybe this is my sort of therapy from having lived in this space now for a few years, but I've been watching on PBS a series called something like The Dictator's Playbook, and watched a piece on Francisco Franco and a piece on Mussolini. This sort of confusion of fact from fiction is again straight out of the playbook. And when that happens, people can't tell truth from reality. The only truth becomes the dictator's truth. What the dictator tells you to believe, that becomes true. And then, of course, at the same time, you're stowing so much chaos that people are scared. People they want to have some path forward, right? And so they'll believe what they hear to sort of address this fear, and the fear is real because there is chaos. It's amazing, Charlie. I'm not a historian, but sometimes I wish if I'd go back to Cornell, I might done a double major, right? History repeats itself, and we do need to pay attention to these issues. We need to pay attention to history because I don't want this to fall apart in my lifetime for my own kids.
No, as you know, I'm a big Hannah Arendt fan, but in part because it's so shocking to me to go back and read her books on the origins of totalitarianism and read how that mindset works and go, holy crap, that is what's happening to us right now. So let me quote for our listeners what I quoted from Arendt in my newsletter this morning. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and nothing was true. So what she understood was the end game was that the lies aren't aimed at getting people to believe what the propagandist is saying. The point was to induce chronic disbelief, this indifferent shrug. Who knows what to believe? Who cares? What's truth? And then the final quote is, the result of a consistent and total substitution of lie for factual truth is not that the lie will now be accepted as truth and truth be defamed as a lie, but that sense by which we take our bearings in the world and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end is being destroyed. In other words, the whole point is not to get you to believe A or B or support it. It's basically to no longer even trust your brain to process what is true and false. That's the annihilation of truth. And I think that's the real danger. And I think that if you have a Venn diagram of people who, are buying into election trutherism, that's going to look a lot like the Venn diagram of people who buy into vaccine trutherism, because you don't know who to trust, you don't know what to believe, and at a certain point, you don't really care that much.
Well, and you just trust your own. I mean, it's called gaslighting now. That's that's in our common parlance, which is this idea that, listen, the sun is up, and then someone's convincing you that no, it's pitch black outside, and then it's wait a minute, am I crazy?
Yeah.
I must be crazy. Yeah, it is pitch black outside, and that's what's happening on a massive scale. It boils down to some sort of psychological elements, but I want to,
if I was more courageous, I would know that it was black outside.
Right.
If you were courageous, we were willing to say it.
Yeah, there's a famous experiment. Actually, my next book is it's tentatively titled Common Sense, also with Harper, probably come out next summer, hopefully. But it sort of brings sort of legal analytical theories to bear on everyday decision making, because I think education and sort of that can arm ourselves with some sense of agency, so we don't have to fall prey to this. But there's this famous experiment that I think it was in the 60s. A subject was shown 3 lines. And it was clear which was the shortest line. And so the subject was told, what came in, said, yes, that's the shortest line. Then there were, a handful of others that were in on the experiment. The subject's put back in the same room, and everybody else in the room picks a different line as the shorter line. They go back to the original subject, and he says, yeah, that's the short. He picks the one that everyone else misidentified on purpose. And of course, this is the gaslighting phenomenon. I must be crazy. I can't look at what's in front of my face. I don't want to be the one odd man out. So I'll pick the long line as the short line, even though I know in my mind the short line is the short line. And that happens over and over and over again. And this is where we are.
Yeah, and I think we understand that even better these days. Okay, so let's talk about Newt Gingrich for just a moment. Mm-hmm. He tweeted out yesterday, Why is Georgia Secretary of State Raffensperger working as hard to add drop boxes and take other steps to make it harder for Republicans to win? Is he really that intimidated by Stacey Abrams? Well, let's leave out Stacey Abrams for a moment. Here you have Newt Gingrich, once again, like so many Republicans, saying that quiet part out loud, where it's really becoming ingrained now on the right that anything that makes it easier to vote somehow makes it harder for Republicans to win, which is a remarkable admission on their part, a remarkable mindset that Raffensperger is not making it easier to vote because of, say, hey, democracy, proving the access to the ballot box, that it's simply making it harder for Republicans to win because the more people who vote, the less likely it is that Republicans will be elected. I mean,
Yeah, and
wow.
you couple that with the argument in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. There was, I believe, one justice who pointed out that this recount effort is only in the predominantly African American parts of the state. So she's like, "Listen, this is an obvious attempt just to keep certain voters from the ballot box. That is, Democrat-leaning voters. This is a very old." Very, very old. It goes back to the ratification of the original Constitution when only wealthy white males could vote, and this is the battleground. And as you point out, we saw this throughout pre-election litigation. Hundreds of lawsuits filed on the Republican side of the aisle trying to keep people from the ballot box. And now we have shameless attempts to literally cancel millions of votes. Unprecedented. This is not how the voting rights, our system works. Like I said, it's hard enough opening the tent to legitimate voters. And now we've got to keep the tent closed from the Lions after the election's over. I mean, it's really, it's stunning, Charlie.
Well, but going ahead, just assuming that none of this is going to affect the 2020 election, and so let's put that in the rearview mirror, it seems very, very likely now that Republican legislatures all around the country are going to use this myth of the stolen election and of the fraud that they were never able to prove as an excuse to tighten up on access to the ballot box. This kind of stuff, Newt Gingrich, making it harder to have the drop boxes, making, tougher ID laws, making it more difficult for people to obtain and to cast absentee votes. That seems an almost certainty. This seems to be something that the Republican Party has completely internalized, that they need to, that it is not a good thing to make it easy to vote.
Absolutely. I mean, that was my Atlantic piece. This has been, multiple steps back, I think, for voting rights litigation. It's no longer, getting the tent more and more open. I think you're right. We're going to see a full-on assault, more voter suppression efforts. And just let's remember the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act that corresponded with the Civil Rights Act in the late 1960s. Lyndon Johnson signed it. That was one of the most successful pieces of legislation in the civil rights arena. And the Supreme Court basically gutted a critical provision in 2013, which basically required states to get pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before they did these cute maneuvers to make it harder to vote, certain bad actor states. When the Democrats took over the House, H.R. 1, their very first proposed bill, would have done what the Supreme Court told them to do, which is go back and fix that statute. I mean, that's a whole other topic. The Supreme Court probably overreached in that moment. But we need to see, on top of many things, we need to see some federal intervention from Congress to re-level the playing field, because I think you're right, Charlie. We're gonna go back. We're gonna go back a few decades, and it's really, really sad, because democracy is we the people, not we the Republicans or we the Democrats or we the politicians. Politicians aren't your friends. It's your friends and neighbors that are voting in your community for what's best for you and your family. And it's really sad. One of our political parties is blatantly saying they don't care.
I'm really interested in your point that you made in the Politico article about the option for sanctioning lawyers who file frivolous lawsuits, and I'm particularly thinking of the Lynn Woods and the Sidney Powells, who once, time and time again, have made filings that were just ridiculous, slapped down, erroneous, all of that stuff. Who has standing to bring sanctions against? How does it happen that a Sidney Powell is going to have to defend her law license going forward, or a Rudy Giuliani, or a Lynn Wood, or any of these other hacks?
Okay, so I mean, one possibility is sanctions through the bar, and that would be sort of the putting the license at risk. But in terms of the courts itself, I'll just speak to a federal court because every state has similar rules. The critical federal rule is called Rule 11, Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 11. Normally, it comes up on motion from one of the other parties. So the defendants in these cases, the states that are defending their elections, could go to the federal judge and say, please sanction Sidney Powell because she filed stuff that is factually and legally baseless. Under the federal rule, she would get 21 days to withdraw her case. And we've seen actually withdrawals. I don't think they were on Rule 11 motions, but so a bunch of these cases were actually withdrawn shortly after they were filed. But so that's one route. You could move for sanctions, and the sanctions can be anywhere from, listen, reimburse me for my attorney's fees. It cost me hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars, or it could be a fine to the court, or it could be, Sidney Powell, you need to get written authority before you file another piece of garbage in this court, or, here's a public reprimand, or you need to go back to lawyering 101 school. Like, courts can do all kinds of things. The other option is federal courts can do it what we call sua sponte. They can say, listen, you tell me why I shouldn't sanction you for this. And frankly, I don't know if it's because it's so political, Charlie. I don't know if judges just don't want to, have to, have their own professional bodyguards now going forward if they take steps that are going to antagonize Trump's base. I really don't know, but that rule is there for a reason. It's there to basically disincentivize lawyers from abusing the courts for political reasons or harassment.
Yeah, and I think that this year has been a really good example of why we shouldn't just let bygones be bygones, why that needs to be enforced, because otherwise, as you have pointed out, it will happen again and again. It will become a norm to simply just file these harassing lawsuits, throw the spaghetti up against the wall after every single election. So I think it's important that folks be held accountable.
Well, and this is very Trumpian. People ask me all the time, as with a constitutional background and stuff, can Trump do this? I mean, we'll probably at some point, Charlie, talk about self-pardons if that's around the corner. Can he do it? That's the wrong question. The wrong question is, what are the consequences?
Yeah.
If there are no consequences, the answer to the first question is yes. So again, I mean, if there's no consequences to filing these frivolous lawsuits, but there's upsides in terms of duping the American public and the base into thinking there's there, they will continue to be filed. The courts have to draw a boundary. Likewise, Congress needs to draw boundaries with the presidency. Without accountability, without pushback, then the Constitution just is a piece of paper, and the belt and suspenders or the power of the presidency gets so big, and then that power gets handed off to the next president. So it's not a red versus blue thing, but unfortunately, civic literacy is really, really lacking in our country.
It certainly is. Kim Wehle, thank you so much for joining us on this Monday morning podcast, December 14th, the day that Donald Trump officially is a one-term president.
It's a big day. Happy to talk to you on today in particular, Charlie.
And thank you for listening to today's Bulwark Podcast. I'm Charlie Sykes. We will be back tomorrow, and we will do this all over again.